So let's have a look at something that's perhaps a little bit more modern in terms of technology and education. So we're looking at maybe some interactive materials, we're looking at audio, and we're looking at video. And all these innovations have a history around about 100 years old each. Let's have a look. Thomas Edison's name is going to come up quite a bit. In 1878, Thomas Edison suggested that the phonograph, we were talking about vinyl, well, not quite vinyl, certainly a different material back in those days, but records, vinyl records that you can see in the shops these days, that they could be used as an educational tool. If you have a look at the pictures we've got here, we've got a vinyl record here, which was called a phonograph in its early days, and certainly for quite a few years. Audio tapes at the bottom there, the three little boxes, basically magnetically stored information on a tape. CDs, optically stored, radio, and the weird thing with the horn at the top is basically something which played wax cylinders, which were also called phonographs, and recorded sounds and played them back for the listener. So the sorts of things we're looking at with audio. Phonographs, which lasted well into the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s. They've made a bit of a resurgence in the last 5 or so years, never quite dying out. Starting off with being wax cylinders, which recorded sounds, moving on to a material like shellac, which is kind of a plastic, very hard but quite fragile, to vinyl, and eventually phonographs essentially died out. But they were very, very popular over a number of years and were used in education in a few ways. Radio had a massive influence on society, changed the whole way that communities would engage with information and entertainment. And universities took advantage of radio stations when they first came out, basically having their own stations which were reserved for them. There were specific frequencies which were reserved for university radio, and they tried to engage the public with university-type materials. As you might imagine, university lecturers were not necessarily the most engaging, riveting radio announcers of all time, and they found it very, very difficult to compete with the entertainment-driven, commercialised side of radio, where there were trained voice artists that engaged with that and certainly engaged with the community a lot better. University radio lingered for quite a while, never really took off the way it should have, mainly because of relatively amateurish attempts to engage the public. Audio tapes followed that, magnetically stored material on the tapes, easily recorded, something that many things couldn't be done with other materials, such as the vinyl. You couldn't record onto that, although you could record onto wax versions of it in earlier years. But audio tapes you could record, they were relatively cheap, you could take them anywhere, they were relatively small, and you could play them on relatively portable devices, and they got smaller and smaller as time went on. CDs, obviously very, very popular for a number of years, storing music, and you can still obviously buy those in the shops with music tracks on them. But also very, very useful for developing educational material and storing that educational material on something equally portable with audio tapes, but eventually becoming much, much cheaper and much more durable than audio tapes were. And finally we get to MP3 files, podcasts, those sorts of things, where we can store any number of audio materials on electronic means, and then encoding it into an MP3 file and sharing it quite easily over the internet. So what could you do with audio recordings? Well, people were quite inventive about those. Fairly obvious one straight off is learning a language. If you can actually hear what the language sounds like rather than trying to read it off of a book, and then pronouncing it the way you think it should be pronounced, it's very, very powerful. And there's been many, many language learning tools starting right back with phonographs, through to audio tapes, and of course you can still learn materials through MP3 encoded audio. So languages is something that is very, very powerful with audio. Other things that it was used for, early doctors used it to record breath sounds and heart sounds from patients, and using that to teach their students about what particular conditions might mean. Taking patient history, so what's the history of a particular patient, using that as a teaching material for students trying to diagnose particular illnesses. Distance education. So there were schools at the air in a number of places, certainly America, very big country, much like Australia, which also had its own distance education program. And this relied very heavily on being able to communicate with people that were very, very remote. Radio was ideal for that, and certainly very, very important for people out in rural communities and their education. Used for army training, the armed forces were particularly rigorous in grabbing hold of any new technologies and trying them on their staff, their soldiers, and evaluating them quite stringently. And there's some good information back from those days about the use of particular materials. So army training, they used that for languages as well, but also in instruction in various other important aspects of their training. They were used to replace lectures a long, long time ago. So back in the 50s, we used radio to try and replace lectures, and also recorded audio files on tapes and CDs. And we also gave feedback to students using audio means, once again, through tapes or CDs. Physical media passed on to the student where they could listen to the feedback from the teacher. So we've talked about phonographs being used for language, as was radio and various other audio means. Radio was used for propaganda and entertainment, particularly through the war years, on multiple sides of particular conflicts. Radio is very, very powerful as a propaganda tool, and obviously equally powerful as an entertainment tool. And then there's film and the overhead projector, which was actually developed during World War II. Many of you will not have seen one, and hopefully never will. Okay, so let's see what happened after World War II. The gentlemen here are gathered around the world's first CD player, obviously not a lounge room or portable device. After World War II, audio tapes really came to the fore, and for a number of years, 20 or 30 years, they were the go-to devices for audio. They were cheap to record on, they were relatively cheap to mass produce and circulate, and they were certainly light enough and small enough to put into the mail and use for manual distribution for distance education. After that, we're looking at CDs and podcasts and various other things that flow from there. But audio tapes really did dominate for a number of years. So, audio was used quite extensively in education in many formats and many places, but was it any good? Well, it was poorly evaluated in the early years, so there's no real ideas of what impact it really did have. There were certainly reports in learned journals about the use of audio for particular learning outcomes, and reports that it was positive and engaging, but not really anything to talk about any specific learning outcomes. When it came to radio, studies showed no significant difference in learning via radio or traditional methods, traditional being stand-up lectures given by teachers to their class. And this is kind of a theme that we will see quite consistently in educational interventions, is that whenever studies are taken, there is very little, if any, significant difference between what the intervention adds to the learning for the students and traditional approaches. Certainly it was shown that students could learn from audio, and that is actually quite important. So the idea that if there is no difference in learning via an audio method and learning in another way, then it gives the teacher, the lecturer, the opportunity to choose a method that might suit his student cohort best and may suit him or her well. Many of the studies that talked about audio and audio tapes often was evaluated with some other additional research. So it just wasn't a tape, it was actually a study book or something like that. So there was some audio with some written information or some images that actually was used to try and enhance the learning experience for the students and obviously the learning outcomes. There was a comparative study that showed that tape was effective in teaching law students and doctors. So there was quite an interdisciplinary approach to the whole evaluation of audio. Comments about, I enjoyed the tape while commuting and I was surprised how much time I used to waste in my car, indicates that the ideas and the strategies that we're talking about now with mobile phones and mobile communications and mobile learning really did start back in the 70s when people could actually portably carry learning materials with them and learn them in different ways. And obviously, the same sort of problems that might have existed in the 50s and the 70s with people doing stuff in their car instead of driving existed then. If we're looking at audio innovations that have progressed and influenced the current generations, probably the biggest one is the digital recording of lectures. We have podcasts, we have audiobooks, and students certainly do engage with those types of things. But the digital recording of lectures is something which is considered to be commonplace now, although there was massive resistance to it when it was first introduced. Does that apply to the classroom? Could you digitally record classroom activities and just expect the students to engage with them that way? Possibly not. I think the age of students makes a difference, but there's certainly areas for research in that particular space. And it's often the case that you're not just given a recording of something, you're given something else. So there might be some PowerPoint slides or some quiz questions that go along with it to try and help engage you and motivate you to actually listen to particularly long and tedious digital recordings. If we move on to video, Thomas Edison's name pops up again. He was involved in some key educational technologies and was quite an advocate for them. So back in 1913, he proclaimed that books would soon be obsolete in the schools. Obviously not right, but his view was that the visual aids from moving pictures was really, really powerful and certainly something which could engage students and learners of different kinds to learn in a more meaningful way than they could from books. There's some high impact things that can be shown visually. They were used in World War I for sexual health films for soldiers in Europe. Early occupational health and safety material with visual impact and good demonstrations of how to avoid hideous injuries were very, very powerful as well. On the previous slide, you would have noticed that there were some things that look vaguely familiar. There was a tape, videotape, which basically stored visual material on magnetic tape. There was the DVD and the Laserdisc, which were basically video analogies of the CD. And of course, there was the moving picture frame, which you saw there, which was essentially a film rotating around about 20 to 25 frames per second, so that the visual cues and blurring didn't occur for viewers. And those tapes would be quite long for very short amounts of educational material. So there was an issue there with the volume. But with educational films, there was really a bigger problem, and that was the fact that they were extremely flammable. So whilst Thomas Edison might have thought that they would be able to replace books, books didn't burn at the rate that film did, and certainly they caused quite a number of fires in schools, which eventually ended up with them not really being as widespread and distributed as well as might have been originally thought of. Closed circuit TV. So the idea that students in one class might watch a streamed version, essentially, of a lecture occurring in another classroom. So this is where classes were of high numbers and classes needed to be split up between two lecture theatres. A closed circuit TV in one basically showed a live recording of what was happening in the other lecture theatre. And then it was educational TV, much like educational radio. There was over 100 channels of educational TV, and universities tried their hand at that, and they suffered the same fate as they did with radio. They just weren't professionally trained enough to be able to communicate educational material in an engaging and informative way for the audience. And of course, in line with audio feedback to students, video feedback was given to students as well. If we have a look at this video here, you'll get an idea of the sorts of things that were shown in early films. This actually terrified a number of audiences who thought they were literally going to be killed by a train coming out of the screen in front of them. Obviously, they learned otherwise. So when we're looking at the outcomes for video being used in education, we find some interesting findings. Educational TV, which was used very widely and had many hundreds of studies which were used to try and evaluate its worth, it showed that there was no significant benefit to using educational TV as opposed to being in live lectures or teaching scenarios. Importantly, that means that there's no disadvantage to it either, which means that recordings or streaming of educational materials